Everyone thought Margaret Thompson was just another broke retiree, but they had no idea she'd been quietly building a fortune that would shock them all. Margaret stared at the retirement cake, sitting untouched on her kitchen counter. "Happy Retirement Mom" was written in cheerful blue frosting, but the sweetness felt bitter in her mouth. After 40 years of waking up at 5:30 a.m., brewing coffee in the same chipped mug, and driving to Hartwell Insurance Company, today had been her last day. But as she looked around the modest 2-bedroom house she'd called home for the past 15 years, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Not the gold watch or the farewell party. Those had been nice enough. What was missing was the conversation she'd been dreading to have with her son, Brian. The front door slammed shut, making her jump. Brian's voice echoed through the hallway, followed by his wife Ashley's higher pitch and their 8-year-old daughter Emily's excited chatter about her school day. "Grandma," Emily burst into the kitchen first, her backpack sliding off one shoulder. "Did you really retire today? Does that mean you'll be home all the time now?" Margaret's heart warmed as she knelt down to hug her granddaughter. "That's right, sweetheart. Grandma doesn't have to go to the office anymore." "Cool. Now you can make me pancakes every morning like you do on weekends." Brian appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie after another long day at the accounting firm. At 35, he'd inherited his father's serious demeanor, but none of his warmth. "Emily, go wash your hands for dinner. Your mom's ordering pizza." As Emily skipped away, Brian's expression shifted. Margaret had seen that look before. It was the same face he'd made as a teenager when he needed to ask for money but didn't want to seem desperate. "So, Mom," he said, sitting heavily at the kitchen table, "we need to talk about arrangements." Margaret's stomach tightened. She'd known this moment would come, but she'd hoped for at least one night to process her retirement before diving into difficult conversations. Ashley entered the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, 2 large pizzas, 1 pepperoni, 1 vegetarian." She ended the call and turned to Margaret with what could charitably be called a smile. "Congratulations on your retirement, Margaret. You must be so relieved." The way Ashley said relieved made it sound like Margaret had been fired rather than completing 4 decades of dedicated service. But Margaret had long ago learned to bite her tongue when it came to her daughter-in-law's passive-aggressive comments. "Thank you, dear. Yes, it feels strange not having anywhere to be tomorrow morning." Brian cleared his throat. "About that, Mom, Ashley and I have been talking and we're concerned about your financial situation." Margaret blinked. "My financial situation?" "Well, you know," Ashley interjected, settling into the chair across from Margaret. "You've been working for 40 years, but it's not like insurance companies pay huge salaries. And with the cost of living these days, we're worried about how you'll manage on just Social Security." "I haven't even filed for Social Security yet," Margaret said quietly. "Exactly," Brian leaned forward. "And that's the problem. Mom, we've run some numbers, and honestly, we don't see how you can afford to keep this house on a fixed income." Margaret felt the room spinning slightly. She'd spent the last 30 years carefully building her investment portfolio, starting with just $50 a month in a mutual fund back in 1994. When Apple stock was trading at $12 a share in 1995, she'd scraped together $2,000 to buy shares. When everyone said the internet was a fad, she'd quietly invested in Amazon at $18 a share. But she'd never told Brian about any of it. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she'd grown up during a time when women were taught not to discuss money, not even with their children. Her own mother had lived through the Depression and drilled into Margaret the importance of keeping your finances private. "You never know when you might need a safety net," her mother used to say, "and you never know who might try to take it away from you." So Margaret had built her safety net in silence. Every quarterly statement went into a locked filing cabinet in her bedroom. Every dividend check was reinvested immediately. Every stock split was carefully tracked in a notebook she kept hidden behind her cookbooks. "I've been thinking," Brian continued, "maybe it's time to consider moving in with us. Ashley's smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. Of course, we'd love to have you. It would be so helpful having you here to watch Emily after school. Margaret studied her daughter-in-law's face. Ashley was trying to look enthusiastic, but Margaret could read the calculation behind her eyes. Free babysitting, help with housework, someone to split the utilities with. But what about the evenings when Margaret wanted to read her financial journals in peace? What about the Sunday mornings she spent reviewing her portfolio performance? What about the simple pleasure of walking around her own house in her bathrobe without worrying about being in someone's way? "That's very generous of you both," Margaret said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm ready to give up my independence just yet." Brian exchanged a look with Ashley that Margaret wasn't supposed to catch, but she did catch it, and her heart sank. "Mom, be realistic," Brian said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone she'd heard him use with Emily when she asked for ice cream before dinner. "You've been working at the same job for 40 years. You probably have, maybe 20,000 in your 401k, 30 if you were really disciplined?" Margaret's portfolio was worth $3.2 million of last Friday's closing bell, but she couldn't find the words to correct him. "And this house," Ashley added, gesturing around the kitchen. "It's charming, but the maintenance costs alone must be eating you alive. When was the last time you updated anything? That refrigerator has to be 15 years old." 22 years old, actually. Margaret had bought it the year her husband died, and she'd kept it running perfectly with regular maintenance and genuine parts. Unlike some people, she thought bitterly, she didn't need to replace things just because newer models existed. "Look," Brian said, reaching across the table to pat Margaret's hand. "I know it's a big change, but Ashley and I have talked about it, and we think the smart move is for you to sell this place and move in with us. You can help with Emily, contribute what you can to household expenses, and we'll all save money." The phrase, "contribute what you can," hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. After everything she'd done for Brian, the college tuition she'd paid in full, the down payment on his first house, the countless nights of babysitting, the birthday gifts and Christmas presents and family vacations she'd funded without ever asking for thanks or recognition. This is what it came down to. He saw her as a burden, a financial liability who needed to be managed and accommodated out of obligation rather than love. "We'd need to move pretty quickly, though," Ashley added. "Our lease is up for renewal next month, and if we're going to make this work, we need to know now." Margaret looked around her kitchen one more time. The morning light streaming through the window above the sink, where she'd stood washing dishes and watching the seasons change for 15 years, the small table where she'd helped Emily with homework just last week, the refrigerator covered with Emily's artwork and school photos. "I need some time to think about this," she said finally. Brian's jaw tightened. "Mom, we can't wait forever. If you're going to sell the house, it needs to go on the market soon. And if you're moving in with us, we need to start looking for a bigger place." "How much time?" Ashley asked, already reaching for her phone to check the calendar. Margaret felt cornered. These were supposed to be the people who loved her most in the world, and they were treating her like a business problem that needed to be solved efficiently. 30 days, she heard herself say. Brian nodded, as if this was reasonable. 30 days works. That gives us time to find a place and you time to sort through your things. Margaret wanted to laugh, sort through her things, as if her entire life could be condensed down to whatever fit in their spare bedroom. Emily bounced back into the kitchen. "Is Grandma moving in with us? That would be so cool. She could read me stories every night." "We're still figuring things out, honey," Ashley said, shooting Margaret a look that clearly communicated how this conversation should end. The pizza arrived 20 minutes later, and they ate dinner while Brian scrolled through real estate listings on his phone, and Ashley discussed the logistics of having a third adult in their current 2-bedroom apartment. "Obviously, you'd need to get rid of most of your furniture," Ashley was saying. "Our place is barely big enough for our stuff as it is." Margaret nodded and made appropriate responses. But inside, she was doing calculations of her own. Her Vanguard account alone had enough money to buy Brian and Ashley's apartment building 3 times over. Her Apple stock had split so many times over the years that her original $2,000 investment was now worth more than Brian made in 2 years. But they saw her as dead weight, someone who'd failed to plan properly for retirement and now needed their charity to survive. After dinner, Margaret excused herself and walked the 6 blocks to Sunset Park, where she'd taken Brian to play when he was Emily's age. She sat on the same bench where she used to watch him on the swings and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The truth was, she could afford to buy a house 3 times the size of her current one and pay cash. She could afford to travel anywhere in the world, eat at the finest restaurants, hire a full-time housekeeper if she wanted. But more importantly, she realized she didn't need to explain herself to anyone. She didn't need their approval or their charity or their condescending offers of a place to stay if she contributed what she could. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Sandra Mitchell, the realtor who'd sold her the house 15 years ago. "Sandra, it's Margaret Thompson. I know it's late, but I have a favor to ask. I need you to help me find a new place to live. Something nice. Price isn't really a concern." Margaret listened to Sandra's surprise and questions, but her mind was already moving ahead. If Brian wanted her out in 30 days, she'd be out in 30 days, but not the way he expected. The morning of day 31 arrived crisp and bright. Margaret stood in her empty kitchen, watching the moving truck pull away from the curb. Everything she was keeping had been loaded up 2 hours ago. Her clothes, her photo albums, her locked filing cabinet full of financial documents, and a few pieces of furniture that held sentimental value. Everything else had been donated to charity or sold. The house itself had sold to a young couple for asking price within a week of listing. Cash offer, 30-day close, no inspections needed. Brian's car pulled into the driveway just as Margaret was doing her final walkthrough. She heard his footsteps on the front porch, followed by Ashley's voice. "I still can't believe she's actually going through with this," Ashley was saying. "Where is she even going to go?" They let themselves in with the spare key Margaret had given them years ago. She met them in the living room, which looked impossibly large now that it was empty. "Mom?" Brian looked around in confusion. Where's all your stuff?" "I've moved it," Margaret said simply. "Moved it where?" Ashley demanded. "I thought we agreed you were coming to stay with us until we found a bigger place." Margaret tilted her head. "When did we agree on that? I remember you suggesting it, but I don't recall agreeing to anything." Brian's face flushed red. "So what? You're just going to disappear? Leave town? What about Emily? What about us?" For the first time in 30 days, Margaret smiled genuinely. "I'm not disappearing, Brian. I'm just choosing a different path." "What path?" Ashley's voice had gone shrill. "Mom, you can't just decide to be homeless because you're too proud to accept help." "I'm not homeless," Margaret said quietly. "Then where are you living?" Margaret looked at her watch. The movers would be finished unloading by now. Her new neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, had promised to accept any packages that arrived today. The champagne was already chilled in her new refrigerator. "I bought a place," she said. Brian laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You bought a place? With what money? Mom, this is insane. You can't just make major life decisions without talking to us first." "Actually," Margaret said, heading toward the front door, "I can." She paused in the doorway and turned back to look at her son and daughter-in-law one more time. They looked lost, standing there in the empty house, as if the furniture disappearing had somehow made them disappear too. "Emily can come visit anytime she wants," Margaret said. "In fact, I think she'll like the swimming pool." Ashley's mouth fell open. Swimming pool? But Margaret was already walking toward her car. She had a bottle of champagne waiting and a new life to begin. Behind her, she heard Brian calling her name, but she didn't turn around. She'd spent 40 years putting everyone else's needs before her own, and 30 days ago she'd made a promise to herself that those days were over. Margaret Thompson was finally ready to live like the wealthy woman she'd been all along. Margaret's new penthouse apartment occupied the entire 15th floor of Riverside Towers, the most exclusive building in downtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city she'd called home for 65 years, but from an angle she'd never seen before. She stood in her marble-floored kitchen, opening the envelope that had arrived from Whitman & Associates Wealth Management. Her quarterly statement. The numbers still made her catch her breath, even after all these years of watching them grow. $3.2 million. Not bad for a woman who supposedly hadn't planned properly for retirement. Margaret poured herself a glass of wine, a bottle of Opus One that cost more than she used to spend on groceries in a month, and spread the documents across her granite countertop. Her Apple stock alone was worth $847,000 now. Amazon had hit another all-time high, bringing that position to $623,000. The real estate investment trust she'd bought into 15 years ago was distributing quarterly dividends of $12,000. She thought about Brian's face when he'd said she probably had maybe $20,000 saved up. The condescending way Ashley had talked about her fixed income. Their assumption that she was financially desperate. For 30 years, Margaret had been playing a different game entirely. While they were focused on keeping up appearances, new cars every 3 years, designer clothes, expensive vacations charged to credit cards, she'd been quietly building wealth. The irony wasn't lost on her. Brian worked as an accountant, supposedly an expert with numbers and financial planning, yet he'd never once asked about her investments. Never wondered how a single mother had managed to pay his college tuition in full. Never questioned where the money for his house down payment had come from. He'd simply assumed she was sacrificing her own financial future for his benefit. And in a way, she had been. Just not in the way he thought. Margaret's phone buzzed. A text message from her financial advisor. Margaret, hope you're settling in well. Quick reminder that you have the consultation call tomorrow at 2 p.m. about the foundation setup. Looking forward to discussing your philanthropic goals. She smiled, remembering the conversation that had sparked this idea. 3 weeks ago, while touring the Children's Hospital where she'd started volunteering, Margaret had met Dr. Sarah Williams, a pediatric oncologist who was struggling to fund a new research program. We're so close to a breakthrough, Dr. Williams had explained, showing Margaret the lab where young researchers worked with outdated equipment. But the grant money just isn't there. These kids deserve better. That night, Margaret had called her advisor. I want to establish a foundation, she'd said. Something focused on children's medical research. Let's start with $1 million endowment. The silence on the other end of the phone had stretched for several seconds before her advisor cleared his throat. That's wonderful, Margaret. Very generous. We can absolutely help you structure that. Generous. The word had stuck with her. Was it generous when you had more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes? Or was it simply common sense? Margaret walked to her bedroom and opened the walk-in closet that was larger than Brian's entire living room. Hidden behind a panel in the back wall was a safe containing 30 years of financial documents. She pulled out a manila folder labeled 1995, 2000 authors and carried it back to the kitchen. Inside were her original investment statements from those early years. The mutual fund contributions of $50 a month that had seemed like such a stretch when Brian was in elementary school. The Apple stock purchase that had required her to eat peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day for 6 months to afford. She remembered the day she'd made that Apple investment. Brian had been 12, obsessed with a new computer game, and Margaret had been reading about this company that made computers and had some crazy idea about putting music players in people's pockets. Mom, can we get a computer? Brian had asked that same week. Computers are expensive, honey, she'd replied, not mentioning that she'd just invested every spare penny in the company that made them. But all my friends have them. Margaret had promised him they'd get a computer for his next birthday, which they did. A used one from the classified ads that cost her $200 and required her to learn basic computer repair from library books. While Brian played games on that secondhand computer, Margaret was teaching herself about investing through those same library books. She'd discovered Warren Buffett and Peter Lynch and John Bogle. She'd learned about compound interest and dollar cost averaging and the power of long-term thinking. She'd made mistakes, of course. The dot-com crash of 2000 had wiped out 30% of her portfolio overnight. But she'd held on, kept investing, kept learning. When everyone else was panicking and selling, she'd used her emergency fund to buy more shares at bargain prices. The 2008 financial crisis had been even worse. Her portfolio had dropped by 40% in 6 months. Brian had been 26 then, struggling with his first mortgage, and he'd asked to borrow $10,000 to avoid foreclosure. Margaret had given him the money without hesitation, even though it meant liquidating investments at the worst possible time. She'd never told him that her own portfolio was underwater by $400,000. She'd just written the check and told him not to worry about paying it back. Within 2 years, the markets had recovered. Within 5 years, Margaret's portfolio had reached new highs, but Brian had never asked how she was doing financially. He'd simply assumed she was fine, the way children assume their parents are an infinite source of stability and support. Margaret closed the folder and looked around her new home. The penthouse had cost $800,000, paid in cash from her money market account. The closing had taken 15 minutes. No mortgage applications, no credit checks, no waiting for loan approval. Just a wire transfer and a handshake. She'd furnished the place with pieces she actually liked, not hand-me-downs or sale items chosen because they were practical. The dining room table was solid walnut, custom-made by a craftsman in Vermont. The living room sofa was Italian leather, buttery, soft, and perfectly proportioned for the space. For the first time in decades, Margaret was living in a home that reflected her actual financial situation, rather than the modest lifestyle she'd maintained for appearances. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Hello? Mrs. Thompson, this is Jennifer Martinez from Channel 7 News. I'm calling about the donation you made to Children's Medical Center. We'd love to do a story about your generosity if you'd be willing to speak with us. Margaret's heart skipped. I'm sorry, how did you get my number? The hospital provided your contact information. Dr. Williams mentioned that you'd made a substantial contribution to their new research wing. Our viewers love hearing about local philanthropy. A substantial contribution. Margaret had written a check for $100,000 to fund the first year of Dr. Williams' research program. To her, it was less than 3% of her portfolio. To the hospital, it was enough to hire 2 full-time researchers and purchase the equipment they desperately needed. I prefer to keep my charitable giving private, Margaret said. I understand, but this is such an inspiring story. A retired insurance worker giving back to the community that supported her career. It would really... Retired insurance worker? Margaret laughed. Is that how Dr. Williams described me? Well, yes. She said you'd worked in insurance for 40 years and wanted to support medical research. It's such a heartwarming story of everyday generosity. Everyday generosity. Margaret supposed that's exactly what it was, from a certain perspective. But she wondered what Jennifer Martinez would think if she knew the everyday donor lived in a penthouse and had enough money to fund the entire children's wing if she wanted to. I'll consider it, Margaret said. Can you send me the details in writing? After hanging up, Margaret realized she was smiling. For 30 years, she'd been invisible. The quiet insurance worker, the self-sacrificing mother, the grandmother who was always available for babysitting duty. Now, suddenly, people wanted to interview her. Organizations were calling to invite her to fundraising galas. Financial advisors were treating her like an important client rather than a small-time retiree. The difference was that she'd finally stopped hiding who she really was. Margaret's new life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the following weeks. She woke up when she felt like it, often around 8 a.m., and started each day with coffee on her private balcony overlooking the river. She'd never realized how peaceful mornings could be when you weren't rushing to get dressed and out the door by 7:15. She joined a book club that met at the downtown library. She took a cooking class focused on French cuisine. She bought season tickets to the symphony and discovered she actually enjoyed classical music when she wasn't falling asleep from exhaustion. Most importantly, she started saying yes to social invitations. Margaret had forgotten how much she enjoyed intelligent conversation with other adults. The book club discussions were lively and challenging. Her cooking classmates included a retired professor, a former diplomat, and a successful artist who shared fascinating stories about their careers. These were people who'd lived full, interesting lives, and they treated Margaret as an equal, rather than someone who needed to be managed or accommodated. 3 months after moving into the penthouse, Margaret received an invitation that made her pause. The Riverside Foundation was hosting their annual gala, a black-tie fundraiser for education initiatives. Margaret's donation to the Children's Hospital had apparently put her on several charitable organizations' radar. She almost declined automatically. Galas were expensive, formal affairs, and Margaret had never owned anything close to an appropriate dress. But then she caught herself. She could afford any dress she wanted now. She could afford the $500 per plate dinner without blinking. More than that, she wanted to go. She wanted to see what these events were like, to meet other people who supported causes they cared about. Margaret bought a navy blue evening gown that cost more than her monthly grocery budget used to be. She made an appointment at an upscale salon for hair and makeup. She felt slightly ridiculous preparing for her first society event, but also excited in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The gala was held at the Grand Ballroom of the Riverside Hotel, the same venue where she'd attended Brian and Ashley's wedding reception 8 years ago. But Margaret's experience this time was completely different. Instead of sitting at the table with distant relatives, making small talk about the weather and Ashley's dress, she found herself in animated conversations about education policy and community development. "Margaret Thompson!" Dr. Williams appeared at Margaret's table during the cocktail hour. "I'm so glad you decided to come. I want you to meet some people." Over the next hour, Margaret was introduced to the mayor, the school superintendent, and several local business leaders. Dr. Williams had apparently been talking about Margaret's donation, and everyone wanted to thank her personally. "It's so refreshing to meet someone who gives from the heart," said Patricia Chen, who ran a nonprofit focused on literacy programs. "So many donors these days want naming rights or recognition. Your quiet generosity is exactly what our community needs." Margaret smiled and accepted the compliments gracefully, but inside she was still processing the strangeness of it all. 3 months ago, Brian had been worried about her ability to afford groceries. Tonight, she was being courted by nonprofit leaders who saw her as a potential major donor. The transformation wasn't just financial, it was psychological. For the first time in decades, Margaret felt like she was living as herself, rather than playing a role everyone expected her to fill. During the dinner program, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced down discreetly and saw Brian's name. "Mom tried calling, but no answer. Emily has a school play next Thursday at 7 p.m. She really wants you to come. Can you make it?" Margaret stared at the message for a long moment. Emily's school play. She'd been to dozens of them over the years, sitting in uncomfortable folding chairs in the multi-purpose room, applauding Emily's brief appearances as a tree or a villager or a narrator. She typed back, "I'll check my schedule and let you know." It was the first contact she'd had with Brian in 3 months. No phone calls asking how she was settling in, no visits to see her new place, no apologies for the way he'd handled her retirement announcement, just a request for babysitting services. Margaret put her phone away and turned her attention back to the evening's program. The keynote speaker was talking about the importance of investing in community, about how individual contributions could create lasting change. She thought about Emily, probably excited about her school play, practicing her lines in the mirror. Margaret did want to see the performance. She loved her granddaughter deeply and didn't want to punish Emily for her parents' assumptions and demands. But she also realized something important. She had a choice now. For the first time in her adult life, Margaret could decide what she wanted to do, based on her own preferences, rather than everyone else's expectations. The following Tuesday, Margaret received a phone call that changed everything. "Mrs. Thompson, this is David Chen from First National Bank. I'm calling because your son Brian Thompson has listed you as a reference on a loan application. Would you have a few minutes to answer some questions?" Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of loan?" "A home equity line of credit for $50,000. Mr. Thompson indicated that you could verify his financial stability and character." $50,000! Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Can you tell me what the loan is for?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss specific details, but I can say that Mr. Thompson indicated it was for home improvements and debt consolidation." Debt consolidation. That meant Brian and Ashley were struggling financially, had probably been struggling for months. All those conversations about Margaret's supposed money problems, all the worry about her ability to support herself, and they'd been hiding their own financial crisis. "Mrs. Thompson, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here. Can you tell me when this application was submitted?" "Last week. Mr. Thompson indicated that you'd been helping support his family financially and could vouch for his responsibility with money." Margaret almost laughed. Brian was using her as a reference while simultaneously believing she was broke and needed their charity. "I see. Well, I'm afraid I can't provide a reference for this loan." "Oh, is there a particular reason?" Mr. Thompson seemed confident that you'd be willing to help. Margaret looked around her penthouse, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers and panoramic city views. She thought about the foundation she was establishing, the research she was funding, the life she was finally living on her own terms. "Mr. Chen, I'm sure Brian is a fine person, but I'm not comfortable providing financial references for family members. It's a policy I've recently adopted." After hanging up, Margaret sat in her living room for a long time, thinking. Brian would be furious when the bank told him she'd declined to be his reference. He'd probably call her, demanding an explanation. He might even drive over to her old house, not realizing she'd moved. Eventually, he'd track down her new address. Eventually, he'd see the penthouse and the expensive furnishings and realize that his mother wasn't the struggling retiree he'd imagined. Margaret picked up her phone and scrolled to Brian's contact information. She stared at his number for several minutes, then typed a brief message. "Brian, I received a call from First National Bank today. I'm not comfortable serving as a reference for your loan application. I hope you understand. P.S. I'll be out of town during Emily's play, but we'll try to see the next one. Best regards, Mom." She read the message 3 times before hitting send. It was polite, but distant. Formal in a way that would probably confuse Brian since she'd never spoken to him like that before. But Margaret was done pretending to be someone she wasn't. She was done accepting other people's assumptions about her limitations. She was done being treated like a burden when she was actually more financially secure than anyone in her family. Most importantly, she was done feeling guilty about choices that were hers to make. Margaret's phone rang 20 minutes later. Brian's name appeared on the screen, but she let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again, and again. The 4th time, she answered. "Hello, Brian. Mom, what the hell is going on? The bank said you refused to be my reference. Why would you do that?" His voice was tight with stress and anger. Margaret could hear Ashley in the background, asking what the bank had said. "I explained my reasoning in my text message," Margaret said calmly. "Your reasoning? Mom, this is me we're talking about. Your son. Why wouldn't you help me get a loan?" Margaret walked to her window and looked out at the city lights twinkling below. "Brian, when you were preparing for retirement, did you ever ask me about my financial situation?" "What? What does that have to do with anything?" "It's a simple question. Did you ever ask me how I was planning to support myself, what investments I had, what my actual financial picture looked like. Silence on the other end of the line. Because, Margaret continued, you seemed very certain that I was essentially broke. You made a lot of assumptions about my inability to take care of myself. So I'm curious where those assumptions came from. Mom, I don't understand what you're trying to say. Are you angry about something? Margaret almost smiled. Even now, Brian couldn't grasp that she might have her own perspective on their recent interactions. I'm not angry, Brian. I'm just clarifying some things. For instance, you might be interested to know that I'm doing quite well financially, better than you might expect. What do you mean? I mean that your concerns about my retirement planning were unnecessary. I've been investing successfully for 30 years. I'm worth considerably more than the $20,000 you estimated. Another long silence. How much more? Ashley's voice came through clearly now. She'd apparently taken the phone from Brian or was listening on speaker. Enough, Margaret said simply. Enough that I don't need anyone's help or charity or spare bedrooms. Mom, if you have money, why didn't you tell us? Brian's voice had shifted from angry to confused. Why did you let us think you were struggling? Margaret considered the question seriously. Why hadn't she told them? Why had she allowed them to treat her like a financial burden when she could have bought their apartment building without blinking? I suppose, she said slowly, I wanted to see how you'd react. I wanted to know what kind of support you'd offer someone you thought was vulnerable. We offered to let you live with us. You offered to let me contribute what I could to household expenses while providing free babysitting, Margaret corrected. There's a difference. She could hear Ashley whispering urgently in the background, but couldn't make out the words. Mom, this is crazy, Brian said. If you have money, we should be working together as a family. We should be making plans. What kind of plans? Well, I mean, if you're doing well financially, maybe you could help us out. This loan situation is really stressing us out. And if you could just... Margaret hung up. She turned off her phone, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat on her balcony watching the stars appear over the city. Tomorrow, she was meeting with the foundation lawyers to finalize the paperwork for her children's medical research endowment. Next week, she was flying to Paris for a 10-day vacation, something she'd wanted to do for 20 years, but had never allowed herself. She thought about Emily's school play, about the little girl who probably didn't understand why Grandma had suddenly become so busy. That genuinely bothered Margaret. Emily was innocent in all of this, and Margaret didn't want her to suffer because of her parents' attitudes. Maybe she'd send Emily a card with tickets to a real theater production. Maybe she'd plan a special grandmother-granddaughter weekend at a nice hotel with a spa and a pool. But she was done being taken for granted. She was done being seen as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Margaret Thompson had spent 65 years putting everyone else's needs before her own. For the first time in her life, she was living like the wealthy, independent woman she'd always been underneath. And it felt absolutely wonderful.